Well, good evening, everyone. My name is, as Saloni said, Inakshi Sopti, and I'm the CEO of the Asia Society. On behalf of the Quorum and my entire team present here this evening, I'm truly delighted to meet and welcome all of you, members and friends, for Asia Society's first in-person convening after the pandemic. Even as you've met and connected virtually with us across the 70+ programs that the India Center has convened over the last 2 years, there is no substitute to the joy of in-person interaction. It's great to be back. Thank you for braving the Mumbai monsoon and joining us for what promises to be a feast of ideas and perspectives from some of the most respected scholars on China, geopolitics, and international relations. We are also delighted to have the opportunity to launch Ambassador Shyam Saran's book, How China Sees India and the World, an incredible work of history and political analysis, and an authoritative account of how China's historical past defines its current policies and frameworks, and in some cases is misrepresented to suit socio-political narratives. As you all know, and lest you've forgotten, Asia Society is a global, non-partisan, not-for-profit educational institution with 14 centers across the globe. Our aim is to navigate shared futures for Asia and the world across geopolitics, business and technology, sustainability, education, arts and culture. And in doing so, we build a network of relationships and friendships among the people, leaders and institutions of Asia and the world. The India Center, headquartered in Mumbai for the last 15 years, provides a unique forum for discussions on regional and global affairs and is acknowledged for being a leading source of cultural initiatives across South Asia. On August 15th this year, India will celebrate 75 years of independence, and on December 1st, India will officially assume the G20 presidency for the first time. To celebrate these milestones and more, Asia Society will be spotlighting India-focused programming this year across its global network. As India turns 75, the time to understand India's foreign policy has never been more important. To strengthen that understanding, I'm delighted to formally announce the opening of Asia Society Policy Institute's office in New Delhi, a branch of the Asia Society India Center. I'm also delighted to announce that Dr. Raja Mohan, one of India's foremost strategic thinkers who's with us this evening, will lead ASPI's work in Delhi, leveraging Asia Society's global presence to promote an increased awareness of India's strategic priorities in global politics and in policy making. Please do join me in welcoming both Raja and his wife Nirmala here this evening. Where is Nirmala? Right there. Before we begin today's program, a quick introduction of the speakers. Ambassador Saran, please. Ambassador Saran is the erstwhile Foreign Secretary of India, President of the India International Center, Board Member of the Center for Policy Research and the Institute of Chinese Studies. Professor Raja Mohan is Senior Fellow, Asia Society Policy Institute and erstwhile Director of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Dr. Alka Acharya, Professor of Chinese Studies at the Center for East Asian Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University, and Dr. Sriparna Pathak is Associate Professor and Director of the Center for Northeast Asian Studies at the School of International Affairs, O.P. Jindal Global University. Thank you all for agreeing to provide your valuable insight on China's politics, its rich history and culture, and its geopolitical ambitions. We'll begin the evening by launching Ambassador Saran's new book, followed by a fireside chat between him and Professor Raja Mohan, touching upon China's perspective of India, why it matters to understand the Chinese lens, and other insights presented in the book, and I hope you'll all get a copy of the book after the evening is done. This will be followed by a panel discussion with Dr. Alka Acharya joining the panel, along with Dr. Sriparna Pathak, who will be moderating the discussion. And the panel will delve into the broader contours of how India and the world view and understand China, and what needs to be learned more about this Asian giant. We hope to open up the discussion for questions at the end and look forward to a rich and engaging evening. Before we begin, a big shout out to the Juggernaut team and Chiki Sarkar, who've always trusted in us for leading book discussions and launches in Mumbai. And equally, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the wonderful team at the Quorum for collaborating with us today for today's program and helping us transition to physical convenings in this wonderful, intimate ambience. We look forward to working together on many more collaborations in the future. Before we begin, may I request all of you to please keep your phones on silent. I hope you enjoy today's discussion, and we look forward to seeing you at forthcoming events curated by Asia Society. And with that, I'd like to request Professor Rajamohan and Ambassador Saran to join me on stage, as you already are, to launch the book. Yeah. The author should not? Okay. There's one there, but we shall. Oh my God. I'm being a little clumsy here. Packed a bit too well. There we go. Yeah, Professor Rajamohan. There you go. Over to you.
Hello. Yeah.
Good evening, and it's wonderful to be here in Mumbai this evening to meet so many new friends and partners, and it's great to be part of the event in Quorum. I'm so delighted to be part of the Asia Society India Center doing this first physical event after a long time. I'll also join Inakshi in welcoming Ambassador Shyam Saran, whose book we've just launched. He's already been received with great acclaim all around. So it's really going to be a wonderful conversation to talk about the book. So I'm not going to take too much of time, and I want him to speak about the book. So my first question to him is, why this book? Because this is not a memoir. Normally diplomats write memoirs, or they write about an area they've worked on. For example, Ambassador Saran was our foreign secretary, he was a prime minister's special envoy. So there's so many things. He's actually negotiated agreements with China, the nuclear deal with the Americans, participated in the climate change negotiation. So there's so much he's done as a diplomat. But this book is not about that. This is really, nor is this about India's problems with China. So there's enough to talk about India-China boundary dispute, what's happening in Galwan for the last 2 years. But this book is about China. What China called China. It's about China. So what made you write a book about China, which is kind of the professors we have who will join us the panel later. They're the people who write this, but you've chosen to write a book about China.
I'm sure that the scholars will do a much better job than I have. Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to also join Raja in thanking Asia Society and the Quorum for organizing this interaction with a very distinguished audience.
I think you should take it closer to yourself.
So to answer your question, there are people in India who are very familiar with China, who have studied China, including the two scholars whom you will have on stage later on. But my own experience in handling China and also, in being involved in policy making with respect to China, it has been that while there is this very small group of people who may be familiar with China, I find that the knowledge about China or familiarity with China amongst, people like you, I mean, educated people here in India, now one, there is very little familiarity with China. And secondly, something rather strange to me is that there is very little curiosity about China. And this is odd to me because I have found China absolutely fascinating country, a country that whose culture, whose civilization is really something quite remarkable. And there are, of course, affinities with India at various points, but it is also a very different kind of a culture and civilization. And it seemed to me that in dealing with China, which has now become such an important country, which is probably the most important strategic challenge to India, I believe that that kind of understanding that there should be about China is lacking. And even in terms of policy making, when you are dealing with China, like for example, a diplomat dealing with China, what also struck me was that we are so heavily focused on security, on foreign policy, but the context in which we should be looking at foreign policy, the context in which we should be looking at defense, there is an overall bigger picture in which you must locate that policy making. And that bigger picture is usually missing. Maybe for a few specialists, yes, but certainly I would say, as far as the political leadership is concerned, that overall historical and cultural context is usually not there. And I believe that in trying to decode, what China is doing, why it follows certain policies, not only with respect to India, but with respect to many other countries in the world, unless you have that historical context, unless you have that cultural context, it is very difficult to really come to the right kind of conclusion. And therefore, this book, that maybe this will trigger some curiosity amongst the educated public in India to begin to know more about what is, I can assure you, a most fascinating country.
What you said about the general Indian middle class and the elite applies even more to the Indian business class, right? The India-China trade today is about $120 billion in spite of the problems we have on the boundary. So even for the business community is even more important. Right? I mean, that China is changing, China's history, its context, and its trajectory all become important. Do you want to say something on that?
Yes, so, China is the second largest, economy in the world today. It would be also fair to say that Chinese economic development is one of the drivers of global growth. So, in terms of understanding the kind of environment, business environment there is in China, the very deep connections which are there in China between the state and business, even though there are very large multinational companies of seemingly private origin, but it would be fair to say that business in China is not only very deeply connected with the state, but in some ways also follows some of the orientation that the state gives to business. And in trying to deal with your business counterparts, you need to be able to understand that as well. That the kind of negotiating stance which your counterpart is taking is not only in terms of just the pure business aspect, but there is a larger sort of a state kind of objective that it is also expected to pursue.
China, as they say, is one of the oldest continuous civilizations, other than, of course, India too. But your book, you cover almost from the ancient period to the modern times, the complex evolution of China. So tell us a bit about how you organize this book, because it's really a vast terrain that you attempt to cover.
So, that's a very, rather expansive subject to speak on. But so let me just try to identify a few key elements. So I point out in the book that one of the rather, shall I say, very specific attributes of Chinese culture is related to the Chinese script. Chinese does not have an alphabet. Many Indians don't know that Chinese do not have an alphabet. Chinese script is essentially ideograms. When I say ideograms, these are really pictures. They started off with pictures about 3,000 years ago, and then over a period of time evolved into more complex symbols that you see today. So when I was learning Chinese, for example, in Hong Kong, at least a minimum of 3,500 characters you have to learn, essentially memorize, to be able to understand ordinary Chinese. A Chinese scholar would know something like 5,000 characters. So you can imagine how complex that is. So there are very fine gradations of meaning that are possible through the use of Chinese characters. So this has developed over a long period of time. So just to point out to you that Chinese spoken in different parts of China may be very different. So Cantonese, for example, spoken in Hong Kong is virtually a different language. But the script throughout China is the same. So even if you cannot understand somebody's spoken Chinese, you can always understand what is written. And this is a very deep unifying factor in China, having the common script. In India, the difference is that if you take classical Sanskrit, the pronunciation was very important. There were very, very strict rules of pronunciation. So no matter where Sanskrit was spoken, whether it was spoken in India, whether it was spoken in Java, whether it was spoken in Cambodia, the Sanskrit knowing people would be able to understand each other. But Sanskrit could be written in different scripts. It could be written in Kharoshthi, it could be written in Brahmi, it could be written in Devanagari. So the scripts would be different, but the spoken languages was the same. Completely the opposite of Chinese. So this is something which, in a sense, the evolution of Chinese culture is very closely linked to the evolution of the Chinese script. And in understanding Chinese culture, that is very important, because if you look at Chinese history, because of the written script, because of the focus on writing, China has probably one of the richest documented sources of history. You can even have dates going back to about 3,000 years ago. India simply does not have that kind of documented history. Also the fact that this script became very much part and parcel of Chinese aesthetics. So calligraphy is a great accomplishment. Chinese characters find their way into Chinese art. So that is why I have in the book, as you see, I have said that Chinese is a visual culture, unlike India, which is, to my mind, a more oral culture, an oral culture.
You said something about Smriti and Shruti.
Yeah, so in India, the sound is the most important thing. So if you look at the sacred, religious texts, they were first, heard, they were passed on from generation to generation, as you know, and then they were remembered. So it is Shruti, and then remembrance is as Smriti. If you take, say, Indian music is very complex arrangement and rearrangement of notes, of sound. And the interesting thing is you'll find that, say, an accomplished classical Indian musician, there is no written music. It is all here in the mind. It's all something that you have heard, you have remembered, and you have built on it. In China, doesn't have anything like that, Or Western music, it is all written music. So these are important differences in understanding. We are also a very rich culture, but our trajectory has been somewhat different. The Chinese trajectory also has been somewhat different. So in trying to understand why China looks at the world in a way different from us, this background becomes very important.
before we come to how China looks at the world, I mean, there's a lot in the book about how China sees itself. Because, unlike many countries, there is a constant sense of their own self-perception, which we can talk about, but I want you to.
Yeah, so obviously how China sees the world is very much related to how China sees itself. How does it relate itself to the rest of the world? I think if you are looking at Chinese history, which I have tried to explore here, throughout history, China's sense of itself has been as a very civilized, cultured, island in a sense, but under constant assault by very aggressive and violent, and of course, in Chinese eyes, less cultured, the tribes on the periphery of China. You had the Mongols, you had the Tibetans, you had the Manchus later on. So China's was under constant kind of assault from these tribes. So there was always this sense that we have to preserve this center for culture and civilization against this constant pressure around China. And a sense that, this cultural center of culture and civilization was surrounded by, concentric circles of less cultured, less civilized, countries on the periphery. So a sense of hierarchy developed, that China is at the top, and then there are others who have to be slotted into some kind of a hierarchical order. So that is why I say that when today we are looking at how China is relating to the world, China's sense of itself is as being at the top of a hierarchy. So the concept of power as China looks at it is a very hierarchical sense of power. And harmony in China is very much linked to that sense of hierarchy. Everybody must know his place in the pecking order. It is when people don't know their place in the pecking order that disharmony arises, which is also very Confucian, as you can see. It is fascinating to see how some of those templates of the past somehow, influence the way China is looking at itself and, of course, at the world.
All countries create myths about themselves. Right? I mean, if you don't have a myth for each country, then you don't really believe in the country. So we invent history, we create myths for ourselves. So how seriously do we take the Chinese view of themselves, as an exceptional, at the top of the hierarchy, we are a great civilization, but they were ruled by foreigners as well, as your book mentions. So if you want to take an objective view of China, how do we, understand, but also do not forget a skeptical eye to understanding?
Well, as I have said, every country tells stories about itself. We also tell stories about ourselves. So there is a mythical, idealized past to which we keep referring back to, and China does that too. But the reason why we have to take that self-perception or that story which China is telling about itself seriously, precisely because it is affecting how China is relating to us or how China is relating to the rest of the world. You may not believe in that history, and that history may at various levels may be mythical in character, but it does influence how China is behaving, how China is relating to the rest of the world. The other aspect, of course, is that in whatever narrative China is giving out, it is for us to, see whether or not this is a narrative which is based on historical fact. There may be some aspects where it is based on historical facts, but there are other aspects, as you pointed out. China has said that, part of the reason why India is perhaps not really an independent country and does not really deserve to be taken very seriously is because through very long periods of history, it has been under alien rule. And therefore, it has a kind of innately slavish kind of mentality. Not acknowledging that for nearly 50% of the time of its own history, China was under alien rule. So, that particular aspect of Chinese history has been smoothed over in a sense. So there is almost like a single unbroken line from the past to the present, as if there has been no kind of jagged edges in that particular course of history. Just like India has been through periods of fragmentation, through periods of consolidation, strong central rule at times, divided into different principalities, different kingdoms. The history of China is also the same. It has also been through those periods of turmoil, through periods of division, through periods of being, very strong central empires. But if you look at what the Chinese narrative is, it is that this is a continuous line, continuous culture. This is what the Chinese leaders keep on saying, unbroken line that China has had, which is not true. But that is the way in which they project themselves.
So we have a paradox, that on the one hand, last 30 years, 40 years, China's rise has been the single most spectacular event in world history, where the dramatic transformation of a poor society into the second largest economy, second most powerful military nation in the world. It's now a technological superpower. So you have this, dramatic change in the capabilities of China. And the sense that the Chinese leadership, it's always choreographed, it's always properly presented, and the sense of authority, sense of a strong state, really full charge of itself. But even the recent history of China suggests it's also a brittle state. Great Mao Zedong, went through all kinds of problems. You had, here is Xi Jinping, who's broken the rules of succession. So you have actually a country that is at once very powerful, very strong, but also seems very brittle politically, seen how they handle the COVID, seen how they deal with the rest of the world. So there is a problem there, isn't it?
Well, this is a paradox that as power accumulates, the sense of insecurity also, intensifies, becomes greater. The more powerful a leader is, the more insecure he feels. So perhaps it is also something that you see at the national level. But the aspect that you mentioned about brittleness, I think, is a very perceptive, insight, because if you see recent history, as you mentioned, which probably draws also from the past, there is a brittleness in the sense that if something goes wrong at the top, then the process of disintegration takes place very, very quickly. India is different. It's very amorphous. It is, you can keep punching it, it will keep swaying from side to side, but there is a certain kind of innate resilience in the country. Also, in terms of politics, the way politics in India in the modern times has evolved, succession, for example, in India has usually not been a problem. Yes, there used to be a debate about after Nehru who. You don't ask that question anymore because, you have been through several leadership transitions and they have not been violent transitions. In China, the non-violent transitions have been exception in a sense. So that brittleness is very much there, but that is, I think, related to the constitution of China as a one-party state. And I think that one-party state, Leninist state, gives it its strength, its ability, for example, to bring a degree of coherence to policy making, which we seem to be incapable of. Or that is the popular perception, that India is too indisciplined and it's always debating everything. It is not really getting down to doing things. While in China, yes, there is that kind of coherence if there is a strong leadership. But by the same token, if that falters, then the negative consequences flow through the system very, very fast in a manner that does not take place in a country like India. So that is a innate weakness of the system.
I think to wrap up this part of the evening, one question, relating to the core message of your book. That on the one hand, we had a long tradition in India, very romanticized view of China, that we're going to be China's partners, we're going to change the world. And on the other, China is evil, China is the worst thing in the world, and we have, because of our conflicts. What you're suggesting is that, look, we need to take clearly, pragmatically, a measure of China, without being angry, without being, too deferential. Are we capable of producing that balance?
Yes, we are capable of producing it. I think the reason why you see those swings, a kind of an idealist vision of India and China being the leaders of some kind of a Asian resurgence. After all, this was Mr. Nehru's own, perception that, in the resurgence of Asia taking its place once again in the world community of nations. That is one aspect, but the other is, after what happened in 1962, that evil China, on our borders. This is precisely because both of us have very stereotyped images of each other. The reason why you swing from one side to the other is because we simply don't know enough about each other. It's something strange to say, but even though we are two, ancient cultures, civilizations, and at least at some points in our history, we did have considerable amount of, interaction. Well, the spread of Buddhism, for example, to China. But, that was in the past. Most of recent history, we have had very little to do with each other. And therefore, it is not surprising that we have those stereotyped images. So one of the main arguments that I make is that unless you can get rid of this sludge of prejudice on both sides, it may be difficult to find some kind of a basis on which we can actually engage with one another and even perhaps cooperate with one another. I do not see India-China hostility as something written in stone, and that cannot be changed. It can be. I have myself, worked closely together with the Chinese on climate change negotiations, for example, trade negotiations, several other issues. And it's possible to work together with them in a very pragmatic manner. So it is not something that is not possible. But I think for that to happen, I think it is important, that we begin the process of actually trying to understand each other.
Because in the book, you talk about, India strengthening itself, being a stronger economic power, building coalitions with others.
Also, there are lessons to be learned from China. So don't forget that in this, what I call a 40-year sprint of China, very high growth that they managed to register. During this particular period, China was a very modest country, willing to learn from others, acknowledging that it did not really know very much. So it was willing to send, for example, in students to the best universities in the West, to learn new technology, to learn new knowledge. It understood that the most important resource for China would be human resource, would be, brain power. I have described in the book that it's like China being like a giant sponge, absorbing knowledge, technology from wherever it could get it. Beg, borrow, steal, keep getting it, so that you bring about the transformation of China. Should we not learn from that experience? Sometimes we feel, we know everything. So that modesty that China displayed during that particular time, maybe it is less now, but certainly during the period of its most rapid growth, that was a very important quality. That, there is something to be learned from others.
Ladies and gentlemen, there's a lot more in the book. It's easily accessible, easy to read, and appreciate it. So please do read the book. For now, join your hands for Scholar Diplomat and Ambassador Shyam Saran. I'm now going to call two very distinguished academics, Professor Alka Acharya from Jawaharlal Nehru University and Sriparna Pathak from Ashoka University. Please, Jindal University, sorry, please come. And now Sriparna is going to take over to moderate the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Raja Mohan, and thank you, Ambassador Shyam Saran. It was truly very rich, the discussion. I've gone through the book. The book is also, it's extremely rich, and it connects to the current mindset or the current needs of understanding China really well. So something which is more deep rooted in history. From there we now move on to something which is going to be more contemporary, and I am really honored to be part of this star-studded panel. The only issue is, and I must apologize to all three of you in advance, is because I have the difficult job of being the moderator, so I'll keep chiming in from time to time. So without further ado, my first question is, given the fact that we heard Professor Raja Mohan and Ambassador Shyam Saran speaking about so many things with regards to China, there's a lot currently happening with regards to the international system. China definitely is an important player. And given the fact that it is an important player, we need to understand it. So externally, there's the US-China trade dispute, which just goes on and on and on. There are other sorts of disputes. There's the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Domestically within China also, there are a lot of changes taking place. So amidst so many changes taking place, Professor Alka Acharya, how do we understand China? Where do we place China? What do we do?
All right. I think I'm audible. Look, I come from an academic background, so in any case, in the presence of diplomats like Ambassador Saran or the strategic expert like Raj, I would rather bring in the academic flavor into this discourse and try and contextualize this question in this larger framework of global China. As Raj said, the reality of today is that China has risen in that 40-year sprint like no other country in the world had risen, unprecedented the manner in which it has risen. And yet, if we look at the discourse on China, the question that academics have started to ask, particularly as we look at this big player in the world today, I mean, is China a part of the world? And why this question is asked is because there is always in the strategic discourse or the security discourse, political economic discourse, there is always a flavor of othering China. That is to say that here is a power that is now going to change the system, that is now going to upend the rules of the game, that is going to bring about a complete transformation of the world as we know it. And frankly, this project of global China, which has started to attract many more scholars, actually contests this. How useful is it to see the rise of China as something that is happening outside the system? Because China is very much embedded into this current economic capitalist economy. I mean, if we go back to the time that the whole idea of Chimerica was being touted, who were the ones who were bringing China into this global capitalist economy? It were the American corporate players. They were the lobbyists for China, and the whole argument was, well, we bring China into the system and we socialize it and make it more like us, democratize it, infuse it with our norms. The moment the Chinese companies start to become competitive and they go out and they start to dislodge American companies, the whole notion starts to unravel. So I would therefore say that we have to see China as embedded into this capitalist system in a manner in which it is both changing as well as being changed. It's not just a component, it is integral to the current world order.
Professor Raja Mohan, I'll just take off from where ma'am left off and she said, the current world order. So, the current world order as we see it, thanks to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there are a lot of changes taking place. Where is China in that? There's a diplomatic ambiguity on China's part because, it continues to abstain. But at the same time, domestically, there's a lot of support for for Russia. So Where exactly is China on this?
Just a word about when China being integral to the world. So when you are a large element of a system, what you do affects the system. Like India today, with the large population, the more we burn coal, we make an effect on global climate change. So if you're the second largest economy with close to $20 trillion of GDP, what China does affects it. But China's rise was facilitated in partnership with the Western capital. So Chinese were smart enough to use that Western capital, and gratefulness is not part of international politics. So the problem today is not that there is not, the West is suddenly surprised, but the fact is China's strategy has changed. It is not the West that is othering China, but China is saying, look, I want to break away. I want to create an economy that is self-sufficient. I will not lead less of global technology. So there is the path that China has chosen, which has created the problems. Look, you are so rich, you are so powerful, you want the territory of Vietnam, you want the territory of India, you want the territory of Japan. So I think it is China that has changed. And I think while we look at the discourse of the West, as West is othering China, because large parts of it, Wall Street loves China. Maybe we can say the same about Mumbai, stock exchange here. Silicon Valley loves China. They all want to make money on China. But China has taken a set of policies which are complicating the system that was built in partnership between Chinese market and Western capital. And I think that is the problem. And within this, Ukraine is just one, the China-Russia partnership that emerged in the last few years and declared just before the invasion of Ukraine as a partnership without limits. So China has made a calculation that being with Russia will further accelerate the decline of the West, and that the decline of the West is good for China. Therefore, that is the strategy they're pursuing. Now, if Putin comes out as a winner, Chinese do very well. But if Putin loses, the Chinese will have problems. So they've taken a risk, a calculated risk. After all, don't forget, Biden met Putin in Geneva in June 2021. So there was an option Putin could have made a deal with the West, but he made a deal with China. So they're today buddies. For both of them, undermining the West is an objective. And I think that's where it is. How this plays out, we don't know. I mean, I'm sure Professor Saran will have a lot more to say on that.
Ambassador Saran, what's your take on that? And I'll add a little question to that. The Westerners, especially the Americans, have often said that, India and China are similar in their approaches to this whole conundrum in Ukraine. Are we really similar?
Well, one aspect that I think we should perhaps acknowledge is that throughout history, any emerging power which has then eclipsed other rivals will necessarily want to shape the global environment to its advantage, or try to remake the world in its own image. So I do not see that as necessarily a kind of a very peculiarly Chinese characteristic. Every power tries to do that. I think what is perhaps worth noting here is that the reason why we have the kind of situation that we are facing today of growing polarization, for example, in the international geopolitical space, is because, again, there are misperceptions on both sides. So, Chinese misperception has been, certainly as I have pointed out in the book, at least since the global financial and economic crisis of 2007-2008, that the West is now in terminal decline. That, historically it has reached its peak and it is now on a downward trajectory. So that aspect of assessing the West being in terminal decline is a very important part of how China is now changing its own stance towards the world. So, for example, with regard to the United States, the dystopian response of the United States and also Europe to the first phase of the COVID pandemic. While China was seen as, yes, using very brutal methods maybe, very strong methods, but it had, managed to win victory over this pandemic. Look at what the situation is in the US. Look at what the situation is in Europe. China, in fact, was the country which was now supplying, medical devices and, medicines or even vaccines to a large part of the world. Second, look at what happened in Afghanistan. The chaotic withdrawal of the United States of America from Afghanistan. Or say a President Macron himself saying NATO is brain dead, not so long ago, that Europe is fragmenting. So maybe they should be forgiven, both Putin and Xi Jinping, for thinking that, we are now in a situation where the West is really in terminal decline, and therefore, as the new emergent power, this is the moment for China really to try to reshape the world order, make the world order in China's eyes. By the way, trying to change the world order is something that we have also wanted. We have also seen the current international order as not necessarily being aligned to India's interests. Why do we want to be a permanent member of the Security Council? Because we feel that it does not reflect our power today. Or even trying to see that, say, the emerging global regimes on climate change or cyber security, that we should be an active participant in the shaping of those new global regimes. So in that sense, in China and India are not too different. But what has happened today is that there is a sense in China, and shared by Putin's Russia, that there is now a space has opened up in this geopolitical landscape for China and Russia to be able to expand their diplomatic space and their security space. Now, I happen to think that China has declared victory too early, and the decline of the West is not as terminal as they think it is, which is why you have the problem with regard to Ukraine. That there may have been a sense, if you look at, say, the joint statement arrived at between China and Russia on during the Winter Olympics in February. What does it say? It is like a manifesto of this new world order. So it is based on that assessment, which has proved to be faulty. And therefore there is a problem that China has, and Russia of course has, which is why I have said that no matter what happens in Ukraine, even if Russia is able to win many more battles, it has lost the war. Because if the objective, for example, was to try and create an European security order in which Russia would be a major participant, that has not been achieved. If the idea was to forestall any further expansion of NATO closer to Russian borders, that has already been reversed, because Sweden and Finland now, right on the borders of Russia, are going to be part of NATO. So what have you achieved? So if you have not achieved that, and China has made a bet, as Raja said, on Russia, that bet has gone sour. So this is where I think we are today in a situation where I think there is a reassessment going on in China itself with regard to where it finds itself in the international stage, and also there are domestic pressures which are building up in China, which may also have an impact going forward.
Professor Acharya, speaking of domestic pressures, the 20th Party Congress is coming up. And there are so many changes taking place within China. There were the protests in Henan, with regarding to the banking regulations, the zero COVID policy. Economic growth has not been as great as it could have been. So, how do you see the 20th Party Congress unfurling, and what implications would this have for, China's view of itself in the world?
Okay, I'm going to give a very quick rejoinder to the points that have been made. When I said this notion of global China has to be understood in a very, very now integrated sense, is because for the first time, unlike previous periods in history, we are looking at a power transition in a globalized capitalist economy. And this is not such a simple forward thing that China is now going to change the rules of the game or is going to reshape the world, because it is as complicit, as integrated, competing, collaborating with everybody else. And it's about that, the nature of the global economy. So I don't think it's going to be very simple for China to change the rules of the game, or whether it would want to. The question only is about the kind of vision that now are coming out, and it's quite obvious that the Americans have failed to actually bring an alternative vision, provide a blueprint, whereas the Chinese are going about it, whether it's FDI or all the rest of it. So, I mean, my view is that we need to stop looking at it as an outsider risen now is going to reshape the world. I don't think that's anywhere on the cards. Certainly, the world as we knew it, the post-World War II Bretton Woods system, the liberal, which is no longer liberal, the neoliberal order, some parts of it conservative, neoconservative, those things are now under attack. All right, to come back to the internal dynamics, and this is where I feel that the argument I'd like to extend further, this global China idea, that as China is integrating into the world, its domestic politics is equally being shaped. This is again one of these earlier kind of ways in which we looked at it, that domestic and foreign politics were segregated. That something that was happening inside of China was not connected with what was happening outside. How China is integrating and enmeshing in the economy has created its own constituencies, its own interest groups, its own lobbies within China, which are equally putting pressure. So somewhere we need to see this link between the domestic and the external as part of the process. And for China, the pandemic-related problems, the inevitable slowdown after 40 years of rapid growth, are going to be the challenges. I don't subscribe to the idea of the brittle party, but I do subscribe to the idea of the economy actually starting to raise very significant. I mean, we're seeing the Chinese are refusing to pay mortgage. That it's, somebody can think of the subprime crisis in the United States. And that's a truly serious matter. The environmental issues which have now come to bite the people, precisely the people who benefited from the reforms. So I think the challenge for Xi Jinping is to show that his agenda of delivering equitable growth and dealing with the offside of the reforms, the impact on the environment, the impact on the iniquitous society that has come up, those are going to be the challenges. So yes, I do foresee Xi Jinping being a bit nervous about how this economic crisis is going to play out. And yes, he certainly gained no brownie points with the way in which the pandemic was handled. It generated a lot of trouble. But the argument they are making is that we saved the maximum number of lives. So that's the basic plank. So I think we are looking at a period when things are going to be under tight control till the party congress is over. He's coming back. There's no doubt about it. He's going to come back. There will be obviously some bumps on the way, but I think pretty much in. But till then, we will see a China that is very, very tightly controlled.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Raja Mohan, taking off from that, domestic policy and foreign policy are deeply intertwined in China. The question is that, 15 rounds of talks have now taken place. What exactly is it, is there something that's happening domestically because of which, this issue, the larger military issue with India, that it is not getting resolved? Can Galwan ever be reversed? What do you think?
I'll leave some of that to Ambassador Shyam Saran to answer. His
Okay, sure.
But look, I think we must understand, as we said, look, today whole evening we talked about. Chinese say, look, this is my territory. I'm just taking what is mine. Just as Putin says, look, Ukraine was never an independent country, it is my country. I'm going to crush my brothers because they belong to my family, I'm going to take them back, but meanwhile I'm going to destroy them. the claim that you owe, the territory belongs to you, therefore, why do they do it? Because today their military spending today is 4 times larger than India's. The GDP is 6 times larger than India's. So they feel the gap between them and everybody else. It's not just India. Japan, which was number 1 in Asia till a few years ago, is today number 2 to China. So if you see every day, what we see in Ladakh happen in the last few days, aircraft buzzing at the border, is exactly what Chinese aircraft have been doing to the Japanese islands, the territories that adjoin them. So I think it is power speaking. So my sense is that for us to understand that the Chinese have a different level of power today, they equate themselves only with the US. They don't think they owe anything to their neighbors because they're much more powerful than every one of them. So they have developed an attitude. How this changes, I mean, I think so far India has stood firm. And what we are saying is, look, we'll keep talking, but we're not going to simply accept your position. And India is also saying what happens at the border will have an impact on what happens between the two governments, on trade and a whole lot of issues. A lot of trade is happening, but they're out of 5G. They're out of a lot of other things. So India is trying to raise the costs for them while at the same time negotiating with them. Whether this will be settled or not, we don't know. And here I might say, strong men are strong men till they're not strong men anymore. We just saw Rajapaksa was a great strong man, right? One day you just run. So I think the hard states are hard till the structure, endures. So my sense is, look, when Deng Xiaoping was there, when his successors were there, they were saying, let's keep disputes aside, let's work through, we can leave it to the next generation. But Xi Jinping is saying, I want to resolve it in my time. This is my legacy. I'm going to solve the problems and take my territory, which belongs to me. So I think that's a different attitude which China has taken. For us, I think we really have a hard task. But what actually happens in the negotiations, we should ask Ambassador.
Ambassador, what would you say to that?
I admire the very deft way in which Raja Mohan has batted this away from himself. Let me begin by commenting on something which Alka said, which is that, we seem to be othering China, and that China is now so deeply embedded in the international system, in the capitalist system, that that is not the right way to look at China. I think China is, of course, deeply embedded in the system. Part of the complication which is arising is precisely because it's very deeply embedded in the system. During the Cold War, there was very little economic, engagement between the West and the Soviet Union. So the kind of geopolitical context or confrontation which was taking place, which was essentially in military terms, political terms, technological terms maybe, but it was not as if the Soviet Union was embedded in the international global economy. Today it is different. So it cannot be the same kind of Cold War, the same kind of confrontation as between the Soviet Union and the United States, which is why the US is finding it very difficult to deal with this challenge. China doesn't have to be the other to try and change the system. I think it is legitimate on the part of China. As I said, it was also something that India has wanted, that given the increase in our power and the fact that we have, what we do has an impact on how some key global issues are resolved. Say climate change, how can you think in terms of dealing with climate change unless China is an active participant, unless India is an active participant? So I think to that extent that China wishes to see a adjustment of the existing system is legitimate. If the World Bank and the IMF did not find it possible to increase the voting power of China in line with China's increased wealth, it is legitimate that China then went and set up the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank or the BRICS Development Bank. And by the way, we are very important participants in that. We are the second largest shareholder in those. So I don't think that is an issue that, somehow we are trying to other China. But China is trying to suggest it is the other. It is saying we are a different power. It is saying that, we are not like the old hegemon. We are different. Our model is different. So I think we have to also recognize that you are trying to tell me that I should be more like you. Just like the US was trying to tell the Chinese. I'm not prepared to accept that. Or if China says that, I have this hierarchy which must be accepted by people, that we are owed deference by you because we are more powerful. Constantly telling India, we are 5 times your size. Our Indian friends should realize that it cannot be the same as before. I won't accept that. You never said that when you were, a much smaller power compared to the US, that, because we are a smaller power, therefore we should defer to the United States. So why should I accept it? So there are issues there. I don't think it's just merely a question of, our not, in a sense, accepting China or, we are trying to other China. I don't think we are othering China. China is othering itself. So this is something that we need to understand. Now, in that context, if you look at Galwan, why has Galwan happened? 40 years, you did not have a problem as serious as this on the India-China border. In fact, both the Chinese and the Indians used to very proudly say that this is an example of how two mature countries can handle differences between them. They are not allowing differences to become disputes. That we have maintained a degree of peace and tranquility on the border. Not a shot has been fired in anger at this border since 1976, right? Yeah. So both countries were very proud of presenting this as an example to the rest of the world. What has changed? Now, this is where earlier we had protocols which said, even if your patrols come across each other, you make your point, you unfurl a banner which says, you are on my territory, please go back. You would make your point, after having made your point, you would never have any physical contact, you would never carry even guns. You made your point and you go back. If there were problems, they could be sorted out in the military level talks that used to take place regularly. So there was a mechanism through which these kind of difficulties were handled. This time it was different. Of course, it is not just only this. Something before this happened in Doklam on the India-Sikkim-Bhutan border. Something happened after that in Pangkung lake area. So you see an escalation taking place. It's not suddenly something which has happened like that. Why is this escalation taking place? Because what Raja mentioned, the sense we are more powerful than you. As I said, you need to defer to me. You should not go there and stand your ground. Because we are more powerful. So what earlier there was a little more sort of accommodating kind of stance, now it has become, why should we let them, do this? What they need is a really rap on the knuckles, so that they don't make this kind of, make mistake again. That is the mentality has changed. And the mentality has changed because the balance of power has changed. That is what is critical. What has changed in the equation is not something that different is happening at the border, but the sense that we are more powerful, therefore we can assert ourselves. So it is not any different from what you see on the South China Sea, for example. It is not very different from other kind of, very much more assertive, aggressive stance that you see on others, because China feels I'm powerful enough to be able to do that. Now, how the rest of the world reacts to that, that's a different matter. There may be perhaps better ways of reacting to this than we have. Mere confrontation may not be the answer to the issue. Today, Raja and I were talking earlier that today what I feel is happening is over the last 20 years or so, whereas earlier the first line of defense was diplomacy. Whenever issues arose, there were diplomats who would sit down and try to talk it through. Since then, the first line of defense has become military. The quickest sort of response is a military response. Investment being made in the military is several multiples of the investment you make in diplomacy. You have many more soldiers than you have diplomats. Now, Raja was telling me that more recently, intelligence chiefs have started coming out in the public. You have had the MI5 chief and the CIA chief making a public joint statement about the threat from China. The spooks used to be spooks. I mean, they were not out in the open. Today they are out in the open also doing things which actually diplomats should have been doing. So you have diplomacy being squeezed by the military and intelligence. There is very little left in terms of diplomacy. So part of the reasons why we have issues that like Alka is raising, the kind of perception that has developed about China, or the unwillingness to actually sit down and try and, argue out these issues, is also because, this environment has changed.
Ma'am, do you think whatever is happening in China right now, it's a move away from Deng Xiaoping's policy of, hiding one's power and biding one's time? Is Xi Jinping is he purposely doing, is he purposely trying to move away from this? Where is he headed?
I think that debate is more or less done away with, this hiding and biding kind of framework that Deng Xiaoping had mentioned or had laid down for as a kind of framework for a rising China which was trying to integrate into a world economy and so on. And that was not it entirely. There was a 26-character strategy that he had identified. Hiding and biding was one of them. It was also about what kind of position they would take on international issues, how would they engage in the neighborhood. And so it like a mantra for a China that was seeking to engage with its neighbors, stabilize its neighborhood, get into the international trading regime, become members of various organizations and so on. Now, obviously, the 40-year sprint that Ambassador Shyam Saran mentioned, I mean, the growth story of China has been truly one of the most phenomenal, historically, unprecedented. And naturally, and this is something that I think Raja has argued many times over, see that as you increase in your capacities, economic, technological, political, or your military, how can it be far behind? That is also one aspect of your comprehensive national power. Now, whether, you see, most of the analysts have sought to interpret this as, so Xi Jinping announces, all right, out goes hide and bide, now is the time for assertive China. The moment is gone. So either you interpret it like that or you see it as an inevitable outcome of a country that has started to acquire greater power, greater capacity. I mean, this is the whole point about the global China that I was mentioning. Today you look at it, whether it is in FDI, whether it is in terms of labor export, whether it is in terms of global media presence, whether it is its soft power, whether it is creating alternative multilateral institutions like were mentioned, the AIIB and so on. This is all a part of the way in which China has sort of carved its space, carved its personality and character in the international system. And the system has been very, very positively exploited by China. So I think the idea that, oh, now they are, this aggressive, assertive China, I mean, that's one part of the story, I think. And that's why the notion of this global China makes for such a fascinating framework, because you then also bring in the element of power. That how is this new global China using its power? And the moment you start talking of power, then of course it's relational. So then you try to compare how have powers earlier used similar capacities as they were increasing. What is the difference between the way in which China is exercising its power and the way in which other countries did? So I think what we need to do is get less focused on the dramatic nature of this aggressive wolf warrior kind of aspect to it, and just see this as a rising power which is inevitably exercising its newfound capacities.
Thank you, ma'am. Professor Raja Mohan, speaking about rising power, we cannot ignore the fact that South Asia is pretty troubled because China's debt trap, diplomacy, China's loans, etc. Part and parcel of the rising power. Now, the question which I want to pose here is that it's not just Sri Lanka that's come unraveling. Pakistan is it's at threat. And there's Nepal, etc. Can India play a stabilizing role? What can we do? It's India's neighborhood after all.
I think it's not just Sri Lanka actually. We are not covering what's going on in Pakistan. I mean, I think today Pakistani rupee has a 230 or 231 for the dollar. I mean, this is where Sri Lanka was heading 2 months ago. That the two countries in South Asia today, which are in the deepest economic crisis, that is Sri Lanka and Pakistan, both have had a relationship with China. I think essentially believing China was the answer to their problems. Because Sri Lanka had problems with the West, because the West was telling them about human rights, Indians keep telling them about Tamil rights in Sri Lanka. So for them, they saw China as an alternative. And I think, look, money has no color. We all know, when sitting in Bombay, we should say, look, money has no color. But when you borrow money, if you're foolish not to look at the fine print under which you're borrowing, which is what I think both Sri Lanka, today Pakistan, in fact, even Imran Khan was criticizing CPEC. But today we're saying, you giving too much money to the Chinese power producers in Pakistan, there's no way the Pakistan economy can pay for that power. So I think, which is what Sri Lanka has done. It's not that the Chinese money was bad. Those who could negotiate Chinese money and build something out of it. Chinese were willing to give money because they are the deepest pockets in the world today. But what Sri Lanka did was to build projects which were not really rewarding. And then the corruption, both in Sri Lanka and Pakistan. I mean, 5% commission, fine. 10% commission, fine. But if you take 50% commission, and then it gets passed on to the consumer, and at some point you can't pay it. So I think these two countries, just not the two of them, there are others in the world. But in our neighborhood, these two are really today classic example of misgovernance on the economic front. And within them, politically, they put all their eggs in the China basket. Which General Bajwa in the last few months tried to look, they must recalibrate between China and the US. But the politics is moving more and more, like this government is accused of imported government by Imran Khan. And in Sri Lanka, they have to go to the IMF. But the leftists in Colombo are going to say, look, you can't negotiate with the IMF. So they're stuck. I think this way, one of the things we realize, whether in a business or in a statecraft, if you don't run things properly and unwilling to correct course at the right time, after some point, the options get very, very limited. Either you have people on the streets, as in Colombo today, or you just can't fix the problem without fundamental, radical overhaul, which is not possible. Again, that requires a great leadership, so I think both are in trouble. But look, Pakistan doesn't want anything from us. But last year, General Bajwa said, look, let's import two things from India, cement and sugar. High price in Pakistan, India had enough stuff to give them. The cabinet said yes. Next day Imran Khan says no. Now, you want to give them $1 billion, say, look, take money from me, let's trade. Say, no, we can't trade, we'll solve Kashmir first. So that is their sovereign choice. They can say what they want, but they're not going to look for Indian aid, even if you want to give them. That's the last thing they're going to take. For Sri Lanka is a much more complicated problem, and I think India has helped a lot. But India can't fix Sri Lanka's problems. I mean, we can't be Shaukar for the whole world. I mean, the Shaukar for the whole world is IMF. There is the Paris Club that you can go to the Shaukar and say, I'll take money from you, but these are the conditions under which I take. But that's where they were resisting. If they had gone to IMF, Sri Lanka some time ago, the problem would have been solved. For us, I think, in the case of Sri Lanka, that help them work with IMF, get the things done, but that involves serious domestic politics. And Pakistan, we have no leverage. We can't do very much. Just wish them luck, because if they become unstable, it's going to be a lot worse for us.
Thank you, Professor. Ambassador Shyam Saran, things seem pretty difficult between India and China right now, given that, a lot has been happening since 2020 onwards. Is there any scope for cooperation in the near future? And if there is, in what segments could we envisage cooperation?
Well, I mean, the period of 40 years that I was referring to, it was really based on a consensus between the two countries that there are issues on which we have divergent views, maybe divergent interests, but equally there are several areas where we have convergent interests, and which is why I mentioned to you that in my own experience, we worked very closely together with China, for example, on climate change. We worked, as I mentioned, very closely with China in terms of the international financial order, which is what led to those two very major initiatives of the AIIB and the BRICS Development Bank, or the setting up of the BRICS itself. As a forum of these four emerging economies, or India's decision to join the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, as a platform where India and China could actually work together along with other Central Asian countries. So it is not that there are no areas where we have no common interests. We do have common interests. His question is whether or not we are in a position to, as we did in the past, deal with differences in a manner that does not impinge upon our ability to cooperate on these issues. I think what has happened is that, shall I say, the terms of endearment from China have changed. The terms of endearment are not as benign as they were in the past. Both of us were using the same language in terms of, that yes, we have differences, but there are many other things on which we have convergent interests, and we should find a way of working on those convergent interests. This is where my reading is that it is precisely because of that change in the balance of power and the Chinese perception of that change in the balance of power, which has then changed this. Chinese are still saying, put aside the border issue, let's work on other issues on which we have common interests. We are saying, sorry, there is no way that this will not impinge on our ability to work together with one another. So some way has to be found to be able to square this circle. I do not think that it is impossible to square the circle. After all, the fact that we have engaged, despite what may seem outside as very little progress on resolving the Galwan issue or the East Ladakh issue, the fact is that some progress has been made. Some progress has been made in terms of some disengagement. Hopefully, we can move ahead. I think it is a sign of maturity that both sides still see it in their common interest to continue this engagement. I think that's an important thing, even if we are not necessarily achieving anything concrete immediately. The fact that we see our interest in being engaged, I think to me is a positive sign.
Thank you. With that, we'll come to the end of the panel discussion. I thoroughly enjoyed it and I learnt a lot, and I'm pretty sure the audience also learnt a lot. Now I'll open the floor, and I request the audience to, just raise your hands. When you raise your hands and, you get the opportunity to ask the question, please identify yourself and mention to whom are you posing the question.
A question addressed to Sir Mr. Shyam Saran about the decline of the West. There was a time when Japan was on the rise. There were books written on how Japan would conquer the West, and Japanese went and bought real estate in New York and they bought studios in California. But that didn't happen. How is this situation different with China today? Could you compare and contrast situations, please?
Yeah, so I think the difference is that even though Japan at that time, I was, by the way, posted in Japan from 86 to 89, precisely at the time of a Japan which can say no. That was, and that Japan was perhaps the next big power. Japan was an ally of the United States. It was not a military power. So what China today says, it's a comprehensive national power that it has acquired in all various dimensions, in all different metrics of power. That is very different from Japan. Secondly, I think there is also a difference with respect to the United States. There also there was a feeling that the United States was now in decline, that the period of American hegemony was over. It's unlikely to be able to reinvent itself. It did. So it is always dangerous to, write off the United States of America. So it has, on several occasions, being able to, bounce back. Will it bounce back again today? That's a more difficult question to answer today, mainly because of domestic politics in the United States. That's my reading. I mean, I may be wrong, but I think what has changed is that domestic politics in the United States of America has become deeply, deeply polarized. And therefore, there is an uncertainty, for example, what may happen in the next election. Would Trump come back, or something like Trump may happen again. So there is something structural that is unfolding today, in my view, which is different from what the situation was before. So both in Europe and in the United States of America, it would be fair to say that there are certain structural factors at work which have brought about a deepening economic and social crisis. And therefore, US bouncing back may be not as easy as was the case in the past. Doesn't mean that, therefore, there are no problems in China, as Alka pointed out. I mean, it's a serious situation which is developing. But that is why we are in a very, very, very uncertain kind of a situation today.
Thank you.
The question is for Ambassador Saran. In the beginning itself, you pointed out about that we don't understand people to people each other. And that is the key thing. Now, I give my background. Fortunately, I had this benefit. My father had spent a lot of time in China in the 30s, and he understood the Chinese mind and their thinking. And I was in Hong Kong from 79 till 84. And I used to visit on business. In those days, China was very primitive, and I understood what is their thinking and what is their mind. And once you understand that, it's very easy to deal with them and to understand what their thinking is and what they plan to do. And similarly, there are 2-3 things which is very unusual with Chinese is that they are not hypocrites. I mean, let's be very frank about it. And as far as the other things are concerned, that once you establish and understand the differences between the thinking of an Indian, I'm sticking to that, and a Chinese. If you allow me, I'll give you one simple example, which I tell a lot of my Indian friends who come there and curse Chinese in Hong Kong, you know, and the treatment and all that. That if you go to a shoe shop in China, in Hong Kong, and you say, well, this is no good, that is no good. This fellow next door is giving me cheaper. That means you told him a cheat, a crook, a thug, everything, and then he will kick you out or split at you. But if you go to an Indian shop for buying a shoes, and then he will say, that fellow is a crook, see, this is my real leather. This is a very critical difference between the way in which they think. And once you come closer to there's no better friend than a Chinese. Thank you.
Since we are running short of time, let's take one last question.
Take 2, 3 together.
Okay, we'll take 2, 3 together.
My question is for Ambassador Shyam Saran. Good evening, sir. I'm Lieutenant Commander Mukesh Sharma. I'm serving in the Indian Navy, sir. So I'm afraid my knowledge is restricted to military and all the books that I've read. In one of the books, sir, which was written by General J.J. Singh about India-China relations, I found a very nice line which I noted down. It was said by the 13th Dalai Lama in 1929. The Chinese way is to say or do something mild first, then to wait a bit. And if it passes without objection, to say or do something stronger. If this is objected to, they reply that what they said or did was misinterpreted or really meant nothing. So I found it way too intriguing, because the way things are happening of late, it very much corroborates with what is written over here, what was said by the Dalai Lama in 1929. So again, history has its lessons. So looking at these lines and seeing what is happening of late at during the Galwan standoff, Doklam standoff, during the Galwan incident, what are the lessons for India? Because this was said in 1929, and in 2020, 2021, all these things are happening. So somewhat it is somewhere related. What is it for India, and how do we deal with keeping this thing in mind, sir?
Can we have a question from someone from my gender?
I'm Anita Sarma. I am Principal Financial Advisor in the Railways. Just to add to Ambassador Sharan's point about, our relationship with China, I think we do a huge amount of trade actually, as we all know. And in the railways, most of our equipment and our, all the new metros which are coming up, our wheel sets, it's all, we're getting everything from China. Now, the interesting thing is, though we have this dispute at the border and these problems, at the other side, we tango with China. So it's a very interesting relationship that we have. So if you can elaborate a little more on that, and particularly with respect to the Quad, is it going to put India in an adversarial position in the long run vis-a-vis China? Thank you.
First to answer your question, at an individual level, there is not a problem. All of us have very good Chinese friends, and we understand each other. We have very pleasant association. So that's not an issue. It's like, India, Pakistan. I mean, we have lots of Pakistani friends who we are very friendly with. That does not necessarily mean that this gets translated into what the relationship between states are, because relations between states are based on the interests of the state, which may not be reflected in the individual relationship. So I'm not surprised that while on the individual level we have very good relations, it may not necessarily mean that we have good relations at the state level. And what you are mentioning about, how the Indians and the Chinese, I also believe that these are somewhat stereotyped images of each other. That Indians behave like this or Chinese behave like this. Individuals may be very different. So you may find a similar kind of Chinese shoemaker as you do an Indian one. So I don't attach too much importance to that. With regard to what was mentioned about what the 13th Dalai Lama said, among strategists in India, or strategic community, what we do see as a Chinese pattern in terms of its external behavior, security behavior, is precisely that, China does what may be called salami slicing. That is, each move that it makes is not serious enough for the adversary to react, with force or with a lot of looking at it as if it is transforming the situation. It's like a nibbling kind of an approach. So you advance. You cannot have a reaction because it's not serious enough. Therefore, you advance further. Through a series of these incremental steps, you end up by changing the situation on the ground. So, that unless your adversary understands that this is what is happening, it is difficult to deal with it. Partly, I would say what we did in Galwan, or what we did before in Doklam, was perhaps understanding this kind of an approach and saying, sorry, we will not let you go any further. So what may have been a Chinese calculation of making an incremental gain, as they have done in the past, it did not work. Therefore, it was a surprise to them, the reaction, that there was a very major reaction from the Indian side. Why are you reacting like this? This is only a skirmish. This is only just a minor incident. It is understanding that, these are minor incidents which add up to something much more. So to that extent, that perception, or that I should say, an insight is a good insight. But what I would say is that, it should be the case with every strategic thinker, you should be able to get into the mind of your adversary and see how is he thinking, and therefore how do you interpret his actions. Sometimes people think that Chinese are inscrutable. Chinese use inscrutability as an affectation. It's not that you cannot understand China, or it's such a mystery, such an enigma that nobody can understand. They would like you to believe that. It is your job not to allow them to get away with it. With respect to the economic and trade relationship between the two countries, I think it merely reflects what Alka was saying, that they are so deeply embedded in the global economy that how do you unravel it? But I would say that even on the economic and trade issue, there is a certain need for India to be cautious, because I see that if I look at the pattern of investment, say Chinese investment in India, so far, it has been mainly in the digital space or in the startup space. These are strategic spaces, and therefore you need to be careful. You should not allow the digital space, which is the space of the future in a sense. You see how it is beginning to really dominate our lives. Not that you should not be taking advantage of economic benefits that can come to you in your engagement with China. As you said, our trade today is $100 billion more than what it was before the conflict. That only reflects the reality. But I think there is no doubt that in certain important areas, like Raja mentioned, the 5G area, the Chinese have lost out. India is, if you are looking at what are going to be the markets of the future, India is one of the major markets in the future. And therefore, there is a certain cost which China has paid by behaving in the manner that it has.
So, just to add to that point, we have $120 billion trade now, but the trade deficit is close to 70 billion. And the maximum amount of India's trade deficit is with China, almost 40%. So you have a problem. So what it comes from what Alka said earlier, China is the factory for the world. So when globalization mantra was at its peak, efficiency overrode the logic of resilience. So it doesn't matter where it is produced as long as it is produced cheaply and delivered cheap. That was the mantra of the last 30 years. China's trade with everyone has grown. It's not just with India. In spite of the Sino-American conflict, their trade has grown. But everyone is beginning to make moves to reduce the dependence over the longer term. Yesterday, I think US Congress was close to passing the CHIPS Act. Japan is investing in production of its own chips. Everyone is making adjustments not to over-dependent on China, but it's going to take a long time because Chinese dominance in manufacturing is not going to be overturned any day soon. And I think that is where the problem is, and that is where the action is. And I think what we're going to see, for example, India's the production-linked incentive scheme, one is the 5G, that India has walked out of the regional comprehensive partnership saying, we can't forever import everything from China, we're going to produce some things in India. So how far that has gone, maybe you'll know better. But I think some things are happening. So India wants to produce more at home, whether it's weapons or manufacturing, but these things will take time. And I think that's where we are, as the current slogan is, no longer offshoring to China, but friend-shoring to countries you trust. That is just the beginning of a process. Vietnam, India, a lot of other countries will do it. But I think that is the change that is unfolding. How effective it is, we don't know. I just want to close with the West.
I'll answer.
I just want to say something about the West. The first book about the decline of the West, 2 volumes by one man called Spengler, was published in 1901. So West has been declining quite some time. So I think the dream of Russians and the Chinese is going to happen tomorrow. I think probably is misplaced, and China, like Japan, has shown its hand too early, and that has produced a backlash. That doesn't mean there will be no change. Change is the only natural law of the world. So at what point would the fundamental shift in the power distribution takes place? We don't know. India, which used to be closer to China, is moved closer to the US. So I think a lot of things are happening because everybody, Europe was very close to China, Australia was very close to China. They're all moving, they're all reacting to Chinese policies, but we are some distance away. But I think, I would say keep your fingers crossed, Anglos are not going anywhere. They're going to be around, the dollar is going to be around for quite some time.
Okay, I'm going to jump in
And
here
Alka
also.
will answer the question about the Quad.
No, Quad, I just, because these are some rather very provocative, controversial aspects. So number one, about the decline of the West. Now, I think numbers. Let's look at figures and let's look at the manner in which the West is contracting. And Ukraine actually provides us with a very good instance. If you take the United Nations, what is the percentage of countries who are with the West? Okay, just about 16%. And the rest of the world is unequivocal on this. I mean, equivocal. They are equivocating. China is traveling all over the world, investing all over the world. Half the good part of the world thinks they are imperialistic, they are predatory. The rest of them are very happy taking investments from China. Look at the discourse. We started, yes, Spengler said in 1901, but what is happening today? The discourse is gradually changing. I don't think we should see this as, yes, I would agree that it is an unfolding scenario, it is a dynamic situation. That's the whole aspect about international relations. They're very dynamic, and therefore you can't think or talk in terms of a world order. It's not much of an order. It's always changing. So, yes, we shouldn't write off the West, but let's take a very hard look at the trends. And the trends are showing that the West gradually is declining, not just in size, in impact, in effect. As I said, that where is the great vision that the Americans, I mean, Ambassador Saran very rightly pointed out, that inside the United States, there is a great deal of turmoil. Domestic politics, is it going to come in the way of it renewing its vision? And frankly, the point about Japan, you had made the point that Japan also was, would it be number one and all. Size matters. And I think we are looking here at something very different now in terms of capacity. So I would therefore say that it's an open question, and we can't really talk about the victory of the West or the victory of China in any kind of, and again, I really do not see this question as this or that, because I do believe that the nature of it's not just about enmeshing. It's that there is cooperation, there is collaboration, there is convergence, there is divergence, there is complicity. The recently very interesting book comes out which talks about why is the West or parts of the West and the rest of the world being so blasé about Xinjiang. I mean, it's genocide, you're talking about it as a genocide, and yet, so it's about an entire ecosystem where you have global IT companies, you have the best of the universities, research universities in the US, you have the global apparel chains, they are all complicit in what is happening in Xinjiang. So it's not so simple to simply, just talk in terms of divides because they are China and they want to change the world and their value systems are different. I think China is changing pretty rapidly. We need to, and about part of that understanding that we need to do, how is China changing?
Thank you so much for this wonderful discussion. We've run out of time, so maybe we can take the quad question over dinner or something. So thank you so much once again. And no ma'am, not at all. Over to you, Nakshi.
Thank you. I know there are a lot of other questions here and all the panelists will be here, so please stay on and feel free to meet up with them. And want to thank all of you, Ambassador Saran, Professor Rajamohan, Dr. Acharya, and Dr. Pathak for a extremely thought-provoking and discerning discussion on China, India, and the world. An economically powerful and militarily assertive China has certainly challenged the global order. And as you rightly state in your book, Ambassador Saran, in dealing with the China challenge, India needs to analyze the deeper strands in Chinese perceptions of India and the prism through which the Chinese mind interprets Indian foreign policy. For all those of you who are interested, Jagannath has set up a table outside, and his copies of the book will be available right at the entrance. And Ambassador Saran, if you're willing, be delighted if you can sign a couple of copies. Yeah. Thank you all for being here this evening and for being such an engaged audience. It really feels wonderful to be back and meeting all of you in person, and I hope to see you all at some of our forthcoming events. And for all those of you who want to linger on, the Quorum has some wonderful culinary offerings to offer, so please feel free to stay and linger on. I'm sure they'd be delighted. Ria and her team would be delighted to host you here. Thank you so much. Good night.